And now I'd like to welcome this morning's speaker, Dr. Joe Chuman. Dr. Chuman has been a leader of the Ethical Culture Society of Bergen County, New Jersey since 1974. And since 2008, has served as part-time leader of the New York Society for Ethical Culture. As an activist, Dr. Chuman has worked on behalf of human rights, civil liberties, and in opposition to the death penalty, as well as many other progressive causes. He founded the Northern New Jersey group of Amnesty International in 1974 and currently serves as president of the Bergen County Sanctuary for Asylum Seekers, founded by the Ethical Culture Society of Bergen County. This coalition of religious and human rights organization provides services for asylum seekers who are released from federal detention. As a writer and educator, Dr. Chuman teaches human rights at the graduate level at Columbia University and has taught at the United Nations University for Peace in San Jose, Costa Rica. He has published numerous articles in the Record of Bergen County, New Jersey. He has also had articles published in the New York Times, The Humanist, Free Inquiry, Humanistic Judaism, and other periodicals. He has had articles published on ethical culture and religion in several encyclopedias. Please welcome Dr. Joe Chuman.
Thank you very much. So good to be with you. I am amazed at the number of people who have actually come out on a day like today. And the weather could not be worse. This is amazing. You people are real stalwarts, let me tell you. I'm absolutely impressed. I thought we'd have 6 people here. Okay. Okay, great being here. The talk is a little bit different today. I want to talk about Albert Einstein and his views on religion. And I run a Tuesday evening discussion group once a month here, and our topic the last discussion actually dealt with the topic I'm dealing with this morning, so it's sort of a development out of that. But it was really inspired by an article in the newspaper last December. In fact, there was a feature in the New York Times last December that made quite a buzz in certain intellectual circles. The issue at hand was the auctioning by Christie's of a brief letter written by Albert Einstein in 1954, which was a year before his death. The letter was written to a German philosopher by the name of Erich Goodkind in response to a book Goodkind had written called, quote, "Choose Life, the Biblical Call to Revolt," that apparently Einstein didn't like very much. According to the article in the Times, quote, "The book presented the Bible as a call to arms and Judaism and Israel as incorruptible," end quote. Einstein used his letter to Goodkind to very briefly express his own opinions on God, the Bible, Judaism, and his relationship to the Jewish people. The letter was purchased by an anonymous bidder who paid the astounding amount of almost $2.9 million for a missive that was barely a page and a half long. The sale of this letter superseded the amount paid for the much, much more significant note that Einstein had sent to President Franklin Roosevelt in 1939 that warned of, quote, "the possibility of the creation of extremely powerful bombs," end quote. Einstein had nothing to do with the creation of the atomic bomb, other than to suggest to Franklin Roosevelt that it was possible to create one. And of course, at that time, the great fear was that the Nazis were working on the creation of an atomic weapon. Okay, but Einstein had nothing to do with the Manhattan Project and the creation of the bomb. But however, the letter, as indicated, served as a catalyst for the research that did lead to the creation of the Manhattan Project. That letter was sold by Christie's in 2002 for the mere sum of $2.1 million. Okay, so this little letter on religion actually sold for more than that much more consequential and historically important letter that sold for a mere $2.1 million. I suspect that the value of what had come to be called Einstein's, quote, God letter is a testament to the influence of celebrity and also to the fact that there simply are lots of people with lots of money to spend on this kind of thing. Okay? What may also have influenced the price is the contemporary relevance of the letter's view on religion. We live, of course, in an age of religious polemics, wherein the influence of fundamentalist religion remains very strong, while on the other end of the spectrum, we have the so-called new atheists, as well as about 35% of millennials claiming to have no religion at all. Religion is a very hot topic these days. In his letter, Einstein, who was the scientific rock star of the 20th century, did not equivocate with regard to his feelings about aspects of the religion for which he had absolutely no use. He directly proclaimed in the letter, quote, "The word God is for me nothing but the expression of and a product of human weakness. The Bible a collection of venerable but still rather primitive legends." And then he said, quote, "No interpretation, no matter how subtle, can for me change anything about this." End quote, a definitive statement of where he stood. But I still remain surprised at the significance paid to this letter in that there is nothing that Einstein says in it that he hadn't said, in fact, many times before throughout the entirety of his adult life. And it is the content of his views on religion that is the mainstay of my address this morning, content which I think should be of great interest, and I would argue of relevance to us, that is, ethical culturists. First, let me explain why I think Einstein's views on religion are directly relevant to us. Since it was founded in 1876, ethical culture has left its followers with a burden which continually confuses outsiders and irks many of its members as well. What I'm referring to is the fact that ethical culture considers itself to be a religion, yet it does not proclaim a belief in a supreme being. And without God at the center, it leaves a lot of people scratching their heads, wondering in what sense ethical culture can be religious at all. For those people to whom religion is prevailingly a negative concept, or are simply allergic to religion, ethical culture's self-identification as a religion is troublesome or barely tolerated. For those who do embrace ethical culture's character as religious, such folks are still left with a lot of explaining to do in defending what does not, in the minds of most people, seem at all obvious. In simplest terms, it boils down to the question, how can you consider yourself a religion if you don't affirm a belief in God? Okay, that's the question. For most people, to be a religion, you have to have God at the center. We don't. Yet, if we look at ethical culture's origins, there can be little doubt that its founder, Felix Adler over there, took religion very seriously and thought that in creating ethical culture, he was definitely doing something religious. Ethical culture was the product of several major intellectual currents in the 19th century that flowed together in order to create it. To put it in briefest terms, science in the 19th century had severely whittled away and destroyed many of the major truth claims of the traditional religions. Scientific criticism of the Bible, archaeology, geology, astronomy, biology, and especially evolution had made it increasingly impossible for educated people to believe in miracles, in the biblical accounts of creation, and in a personal God who intervenes in human affairs and who punishes the wicked and rewards the righteous. And yet, while science destroyed many religious beliefs about the world, it couldn't totally do away with the religious spirit. The great German philosopher Immanuel Kant had powerfully argued that all we can know are those things that we can experience, that is, experienced through our five senses. And realities that transcend the world, so to speak, that transcend the world of our sense experience, among them God, we simply cannot know. But some of Kant's followers believe that we can get to know these transcendental realities, not through our reason or science or through our normal experience, but by means of our intuition and our feelings. Our intuition and our feelings. Such thinkers became known as romantics, and they had great influence in literature, art, philosophy, and religion. One of the great American thinkers who was an exponent of this romantic tradition was the sage Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson did not believe in supernaturalism, or a personal God, or in miracles. He had once said miracles are monsters. But he did believe in an all-encompassing, impersonal is important here, impersonal spirit that pervades all things, including us. We can sense the spiritual reality, for example, when walking through the woods and imbibing the grandeur of nature. We can sense it in the loftiest ideals of truth, beauty, and justice. And we can sense it in the highest aspirations of women and men that elevate us. There is the world we apprehend with our senses, but this romantic sensibility imbues us with the feeling that there is something beyond it all, that there is something, quote, more to reality than the world that normally focuses our attention and preoccupies us. However indefinable this something, quote, more may be. It is this sensibility of a reality beyond the material world that we know through the regular use of our senses and is dispensed to us through the use of science, a realm which is august, sublime, yet impersonal, that Emerson and those like him referred to as spiritual or religious. As it turns out, Felix Adler, our founder, was greatly influenced by Emerson and broadly shared Emerson's sensibility about religion and the religious. Felix Adler once described ethical culture by proclaiming that it is, quote, ultra-scientific without being anti-scientific. In other words, Adler embraced the scientific world. He said it's a fool who does not basically accede to the dispensations of science. But he felt beyond the world that science reveals to us, that discovers for us, that there is a type of impersonal, transcendental, spiritual something out there beyond the world of our senses. In other words, he accepted the scientific worldview, again, but believed that there is a wider reality beyond the reality that science uncovers for us. But again, this wider reality is not supernatural or personal, whereas anything to do with the creeds, doctrines, and myths associated with the historical religions such as Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, and so on. It is a generic, universal religious sensibility, so to speak, and is not exclusively identified with any specific historical religion, although the traditional religions may express or be inspired by elements of it. While he had his own specific take on it, Einstein's religion and sense of the religious falls into this general sense of religious appreciation. And it was this appreciation of religion that places, I argue, Einstein very close to us and led him to appreciate ethical culture not merely for our achievements in the arena of social justice, but for what ethical culture essentially is and religiously stands for. But Einstein did not merely know ethical culture from a distance. Before World War I, ethical culture was in fact an international movement, with societies and fellowships in Great Britain, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and elsewhere. We even had a small fellowship in the early 20th century in Tokyo. When in the first decade of the 20th century, Einstein was working in a patent office in Bern, Switzerland, and where he was scratching out the theory of special relativity, he would, on occasion, attend meetings of a local ethical culture fellowship in the spirit of learning. Wouldn't it be marvelous if it was actually inspired to the theory of relativity as a result of a platform address given? I want historians to be able to make that linkage. That would boost ethical culture's cred. Okay, I don't think it's going to happen. Anyway, he would occasionally attend ethical culture, meetings in Bern, Switzerland. And almost 50 years later, in a very laudatory letter, Einstein praised not only the work of ethical culture, but our underlying sensibilities in a way that I personally believe gets it exactly right. I'll get to that statement towards the end of my address, but first some discussion that lies in between those two events. Albert Einstein was born in the city of Ulm, Germany, which was formerly in East Germany, on March 14th, it's almost his birthday, 1879, into a family of assimilated German Jews. His first formal education started at the age of 6 in a Catholic primary school in Munich, where the family moved a year after his birth. But his family also had him privately tutored in the principles of Judaism as a counterweight to the Catholic teaching he was receiving in his primary school. It was at public school at the age of 7 that the young Einstein, the only Jewish student in his class, had his first encounters with anti-Semitism, influencing for the rest of his life. It was shortly after this that Einstein was introduced to scientific texts, which led him to an absolute abandonment of both Christian and Judaic principles he was taught up until that age. His introduction to science was a type of awakening, which by his own admission led to a suspicion of every kind of authority, a deep sense of skepticism about received values in general. Einstein, and this was part of his scientific creativity, was an anti-authoritarian. That was very clear. It's deeply rooted in his character. Anti-authoritarianism was something that was really part of who he was. Einstein, for example, hated militarism. He didn't like parades. I don't like parades either, I must say. He didn't like parades, and as is well known, he was visibly a nonconformist when it came to his personal attire. Okay, he didn't on occasion even wear socks. Okay, he was incredibly unkempt. Okay, and needed help and advice in terms of dressing properly. Now it is true. I guess he could pull it out when he really had to. When he won the Nobel Prize, he did appear to receive the award wearing a tuxedo, but I'm sure he had a lot of help. Okay, that was part of his nonconformity. He famously said that I'm dressed the same way whether I am greeting royalty or greeting a commoner. That he had, and that was part of his sensibility, okay? If you're Einstein and applying for a job interview, I guess you can get away with that, but you know, not everyone can. Having fled the horrors of Nazism, Einstein was a humanitarian and internationalist who once said, quote, "Nationalism is an infantile sickness. It is the measles of the human race," end quote. And he rebelled against the dictates of received religion. No doubt his anti-authoritarianism was linked to his extraordinary and unique scientific genius and creativity. But there were other sources of that scientific creativity, which we'll get to in a little while. His rejection of Judaic principles were manifest, among other things, in his refusal to have a bar mitzvah, and his marrying a woman in his first marriage of Greek Orthodox descent, and at the end of his life choosing to be cremated, which is contrary to Jewish religious doctrine. As far as is known, Einstein never attended a religious service at a synagogue and only went into synagogues for social events. But his rejection of traditional religion presents the firstborn of what on its face strikes one as a contradiction, which can only be resolved through an understanding of Einstein's specific interpretation and understanding of religion. On the one hand, he powerfully, indeed at times militantly, rejected the manifestations of traditional religion, Jewish, Christian, and otherwise. This included the rejection of religious myths, doctrines, and afterlife, and most especially any belief in a supernatural, and I have to underline the word supernatural, a supernatural God, a God who is personal, judges us, or in any sense enters into the world through revelation, doctrines proclaimed through sacred scriptures, or through miracles. He at times was acerbic in his condemnation of supernaturalist religion with a vigor that would warm the heart of a militant new atheist. In fact, Richard Dawkins, the famous new atheist, was an unsuccessful bidder for Einstein's God letter. I guess he couldn't pony out $2.9 million. Not untypical was the following, which was quoted from Einstein's obituary in the New York Times on April 19, 1955. Quote, "I cannot imagine," Einstein said, "a God who rewards and punishes the objects of his creation, whose purposes are modeled after our own. A God, in short, who is but a reflection of human frailty. Neither can I believe that an individual survives the death of his body, although feeble souls harbor such thoughts through fear or ridiculous egoisms." End quote. Now that's pretty strong stuff, okay? Pretty strong militant stuff. At the same time, Einstein proclaimed with equal vigor and conviction that he was a very religious person, and that he was not an atheist, agnostic, or even a free thinker. Okay? When it comes to his position on atheism, the contemporary militant or new atheist will derive neither support nor comfort from Einstein. In fact, he could be as caustic in his criticism of atheists as he was in Orthodox believers. He declared, quote, "There are people who say there is no God, but what really makes me angry is that they quote me for support of such views," end quote. Okay? Then in an address given in 1941, Einstein elaborated. He says, "I was barked at by numerous dogs who are earning their food, guarding ignorance and superstition for the benefit of those who profit from it. Then there are the fanatic atheists, whose intolerance is of the same kind," he says, "as the intolerance of the religious fanatics and comes from the same source. They are like slaves who still feel the weight of their chains, which they have thrown off after hard struggle. They are creatures who, in their grudge against the traditional opium of the people, cannot bear the music of the spheres. The wonder," and he writes that with a capital W, "the wonder of nature does not become smaller because one cannot measure it by the standards of human moral and human aims," end quote. That last sentence referencing, quote, "the wonder of nature," opens the door to Einstein's view on God and religion. In order to unravel this ostensible contradiction, one has to look into what Einstein meant by God and in what sense he was religious. It should be said at the start that Einstein took his religious views very seriously and spoke and wrote about religion throughout his life, in private conversations, in correspondences, in written essays, and in public meetings. In fact, as implied, he often asserted that his religious sensibilities were a necessary source for his scientific insights. For him, religion and religious vocabulary were not metaphors. He meant it in a very substantive sense. When asked about his views on God, Einstein frequently and somewhat cagily responded that, quote, he believed in the God of Spinoza. Okay, that was a common refrain. In order to know what he meant, one needs to know about the nature of Spinoza's God. Okay? And believe me, I can't. I've read Spinoza's Ethics. I can't communicate this successfully in 15 minutes. Okay? But I'll try as best I can. Baruch Spinoza was a 17th century Dutch Jewish philosopher who was a rationalist and flourished in the age of science and was an early figure in the European Enlightenment. In his philosophy, Spinoza was 100, if not 200 years ahead of his time, and in many ways helped to create the modern world. Spinoza was a very important figure. From a religious perspective, Spinoza's views were totally heretical. As is well known, he was excommunicated from the Amsterdam Jewish community while never converting to Christianity. I mean, Spinoza lived at the cusp between the Middle Ages and the modern period. And in some ways, some historians have said with a little bit of a flourish that he was the first modern secular person, in the sense that in the Middle Ages, you didn't have free-floating individuals just walking around. Everyone was part of and identified as part of a religious community. You were either part of the Christendom, the Jewish community, or the Islamic community. But the idea that you were an individual citizen that was basically did not belong to, I think I dropped this thing, that did not belong to a religious community was something that was not part of medieval identity. And yet Spinoza left the Jewish community, never looked back, and did not convert to Christendom. So in that sense, he was, one could argue, he was among the first modern citizens, first modern people, ushers in a modern sensibility. Jewish and Christian theology is based on the premise that reality is comprised of two separate substances. I do not know why this is resonating.
Can you clip it onto your tie?
Yeah, okay. that reality is basically comprised of two separate substances. There is spirit on the one hand, and there is matter on the other. Or one might say there is God and there is nature. In his masterpiece, The Ethics, which is written in the form of geometric axioms, postulates, and theorems, Spinoza was able to demonstrate with unsparing logic that there exists not two substances, but simply one. He used what's known as the scholastic reasoning, or the logic of the medievals, to demonstrate that there are not two substances, which is the mainstay of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic theology, but in effect only a single substance. Reality is not divided, therefore, into God and nature, but God and nature are one and the same. God is not supernatural or above or outside of nature. God is nature. Nature is God. That is total heresy from a Jewish or Christian point of view, or from a Muslim point of view. But if God is nature, then Spinoza's God, as implied, is almost nothing like the God of Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. If God is nature, then Spinoza's God is austerely and totally impersonal, just as nature is impersonal. If God is nature, then God is not a creator. And in Spinoza's view, nature is self-created, so to speak. Spinoza's God has no will, has no intention, has no will or self-consciousness. Okay? If Spinoza's God has, quote, a will, then there is no intentionality to it. It is simply the way nature behaves. Or we might say God's will is identical to the laws of nature. Spinoza's God has no ethical properties, and what we humans consider to be good or evil is therefore simply relative to our human interests. Spinoza's God, needless to say, does not reward or punish humans for their behavior, and Spinoza's God is certainly not one whom you would pray to. Okay. But most important for Einstein is that nature, according to Spinoza, and here we can see the influence of Newtonian science on both Spinoza and Einstein, nature behaves according to laws and reasons that are completely and thoroughly deterministic. To state it in the broadest terms, nature or God is an infinitely vast and wondrous system comprised of a concatenation of causes and effects for which there are no exceptions whatsoever. Reality is an infinitely vast structure in which effects result from causes, and everything is conjoined in a way that is ultimately rationally structured and coherent. Every action, everything that occurs as a result of causes that are rationally conjoined to each other. Okay? All of reality is ultimately basically this architecture of rational coherence. Therefore, there is, in Einstein's and Spinoza's view, there is no freedom, there are no accidents, okay, in either Spinoza's or Einstein's sense of understanding of reality. Indeed, Einstein had famously proclaimed that, quote, God does not play dice with the universe, end quote. That was a statement of his determinism. Okay? If things seem to happen by accident or for no ostensible reason, it is not because they do. We just assume that they do because we are ignorant, because our knowledge, our reason and science have not penetrated far enough for us to understand the way in which phenomena are the product of ulterior causes. For Spinoza and for Einstein, this determinism pertains to human thought, to our thoughts, to our feelings, and our actions. For as Spinoza has made clear, we are simply natural beings who are part of nature and have no special status outside of nature, as the traditional religions have maintained. For Einstein, this vast, infinite, indeed infinite system of causes and effects that makes up the universe and is in its deepest sense completely rational was the wellspring of powerful religious feelings and a source of inspiration. For Einstein, knowledge of God can be attained by observing the visible processes of nature, but with the proviso that the manifestation of the divine in the universe
is only very, very, very partially, perhaps infinitesimally, comprehensible to the human intellect. In other words, we can only grasp the tiniest part of the vast system, rational system of nature. For Einstein, reality is a huge rational system which, through the use of our own reason and science, we can get to know. But again, and this has to be emphasized, we can know only a very, very small part of it. Beyond what we can know lies the vast unknown that gives rise to a sense of mystery, which Einstein construed as sublime and inspiring. But behind it all is encompassing reason, with a capital R, which he identified with God. Okay. God is the rational system which lies behind or within nature and structures it. He even went so far as to say, quote, everyone who is seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that a spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe, a spirit vastly superior to that of man, and one in the face of which we, with our modest powers, must feel humble. End quote. To put it in simpler terms, he said, my views are near to those of Spinoza. Admiration for the beauty of and belief in the logical simplicity of the order and harmony which we can grasp humbly and only imperfectly. End quote. Einstein often referred to these views as, quote, cosmic religion, which gives rise to cosmic religious feelings, which are akin to feelings of awe. Einstein had once said, quote, the most beautiful experience we can have is of the mysterious, a knowledge of the existence of something we cannot penetrate, our perceptions of the profoundest reason and the most radiant beauty, which only in their most primitive forms are accessible to our minds. It is this knowledge and this emotion that constitutes true religiosity in this sense, and in this sense alone, I am a deeply religious man. I don't know if this is getting across. Is this making any sense? Okay, right, okay, I'm trying to lay this out. Okay. Cosmic religious feelings also give rise, as he put it, to recognition of, quote, the futility of human desires and the sublimity and marvelous order which reveals itself both in nature and in the world of thought, end quote. But these feelings for Einstein were not merely window dressing, as I said before, not by any means. Einstein fervently believed that an apprehension of the mysterious, of awe, and the belief that behind or within reality there exists an order that is rationally structured and is scrutable to the human mind, even very partially, is what impels and inspires scientific discovery. Speaking about his profession, he said, quote, science can only be created by those who are thoroughly imbued with the aspiration towards truth and understanding. This source of feeling, however, springs from the sphere of religion. I cannot conceive of the genuine scientist without that profound faith. That's a big claim. The situation may be expressed by an image. Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. Science without religion is lame because scientific discovery requires that faith in the rational structure of reality inspired by a sense of mystery and awe, and religion without science is blind because religion, as Einstein understands it, emanates from a cosmic appreciation of nature which science progressively reveals. And so we have Einstein's religion, a cosmic religion without supernaturalism or personal God. But as shown, it is a religion that is tagged to a scientific worldview and to nature. It inspires feelings of wonder, mystery, and awe, and requisite humility. And it is inspired by the faith that beyond our very partial understanding, there exists a wider reality that is ordered by reason, and through our own use of reason and science, we can gain a grasp of this reality, again, however limited. Awe, mystery, wonder, the impulse to know, and humility are the mainstays of Einstein's religion. His religious feelings and his sense of what he calls cosmic religion. The reality of ultimate reason, which deterministically orders and structures it all, of which we can only uncover the tiniest glimpse, is Einstein's God. So, let me close by saying that when it comes to ethics, Despite his philosophical determinism, he claims, as many determinists do and must, okay? If you're a determinist, you have a problem with ethics. If all our behaviors are determined by prior actions, then we can have no accountability or responsibility, right? And there can be no morality, there can be no choice. Choice is based on freedom to choose, right? The good or the bad or whatever. There can be no responsibility. So all determinists are stuck with that problem of how do we maintain morality, how do we maintain a judicial and legal system where we have to hold people accountable, and so on and so forth. And Einstein basically draws the conclusion that most determinists do, okay? And that is that human beings in the social arena, in the world in which we operate, have to operate as if we were free, okay? Even though in the ultimate recesses of reality, it's all determined all the way down, okay? That is, in effect, his notion. We have to operate as if we were free, or else we could not have, we could live in a society in that regard. Well, for Einstein, ethical behavior should be based on sympathy, education, and social ties and needs. In his view of our moral conduct, on which as a humanitarian and world figure, Einstein placed great emphasis, it is nevertheless independent, our ethics is independent of religion and science. He was among those thinkers who believed that science can tell us what is, but it cannot tell us how we ought to behave. The wellspring of our moral behavior comes from elsewhere. Our socialization, the types of things we teach in the ethical culture Sunday schools, our experiences, our general experience, and so forth. And speaking of ethics, this would be a good time to end by invoking Albert Einstein's letter to the New York Society of Ethical Culture, written in January 1951, congratulating ethical culture on its 75th anniversary. So he knew ethical culture as a young man, he knew ethical culture as an old man. If truth be told, the motivation to write this letter came as a result of an invitation from Algernon Black, the leader of the New York Society. Einstein did not spontaneously feel like congratulating us on our 75th anniversary. He was invited to congratulate us on our 75th anniversary. Okay, gotta be honest. Okay. I should say, I like this missive, not only because Einstein was extremely laudatory about ethical culture, but because it expresses, I think, very correctly what lies at the heart of ethical culture and the emotional basis for ethics, an understanding which was very close to Einstein's own thinking. It does not express his cosmic view, his cosmic religion, but does emphasize that our morality is ultimately based on nurturing moral feelings and is not ultimately a product of our intellect, okay, of our reason, but more a function of feeling. And it is this basis of morality that makes ethical culture necessary. So let me end by reading that letter to you, okay, which maybe if anyone can locate it, we could auction off for at least $5 million. I gotta tell you, when I was writing this, I contacted Mark Bernstein, who was the last archivist at the New York Ethical Society, and I talked to him about it, and I said, over the years of working in our basement, looking through all our documents, did you ever come across this letter? I mean, it could be a gold mine that we're sitting on, and so on. And he said there is in the basement, there is in the archives, a box, okay? A box of documents that says on the box, 75th anniversary celebration. And in the box is a brochure that the New York Society produced in 1951, okay, on its 70th anniversary. And it has, in the brochure, a copy of the letter that was written in German. Einstein was always more comfortable in German than he was in English. Written in German with the English translation. So I said to Mark, where is the original? Where is it? And he said, I don't know. I don't know where it is, but I gotta tell you, it's gotta be somewhere. Nobody would have thrown that out. You know, we may be sitting on a real gold mine. And now knowing what these things are worth. Right? Anyway, let me read, I'll end my address by reading that letter to you. Again, Einstein does not express his cosmic religious view, his sense of awe. He talks about his understanding of where ethics comes from, which again comes from the human experience, and most of all from our emotions and not our intellect. Our ethics is ultimately not reducible to questions of reason, but questions of feeling. Okay. He says, I feel the need of sending my congratulations and good wishes to your Ethical Culture Society on the occasion of its anniversary celebration. True, this is not a time when we can regard with satisfaction the results which honest striving on the ethical plane has achieved in these 75 years. For one can hardly assert that the moral aspect of human life in general is today more satisfactory than it was in 1876. I mean, we're just 6 years beyond World War II, right? So I think that must be part going on as well. At the same time, the view, at the same time, the view obtained that everything was to be hoped for from enlightenment in the field of ascertainable scientific fact and from the conquest of prejudice and superstition. All of this, of course, is important and worthy of the best efforts of the finest people. And in this regard, much has been accomplished in these 75 years and has been disseminated by means of literature and the stage. But the clearing away of obstacles does not by itself lead to an ennoblement of social and individual life. For along with this negative result, a positive aspiration and effort for an ethical moral configuration of our common life is of overriding importance. Here, no science can save us. I believe indeed that overemphasis, he says, on the purely intellectual attitude, often directed solely to the practical and factual in our education, has led directly to the impairment of ethical values. I am not thinking so much of the dangers which technical progress has directly confronted mankind, as of the stifling of mutual human considerations by a matter-of-fact habit of thought, which has come to lie like a killing frost upon human relations. Fulfillment on the moral and aesthetic plane is a goal which lies closer to the preoccupations of art than it does to those of science. Of course, understanding of our fellow beings is important, but this understanding becomes fruitful only when it is sustained by sympathetic feelings in joy and in sorrow. The cultivation of this most important stream of moral action is that which is left of religion when it has been purified of the elements of superstition. In this sense, religion forms an important part of education, where it receives far too little consideration, and that little not sufficiently systematic. The frightful dilemma of the political world situation has much to do with this sin of omission on the part of our civilization. And then he concludes his letter by saying, without, quote, ethical culture, small e, small c, without ethical culture, there is no salvation for humanity.